initiative and what you guys are doing. I thought it was amazing. It was just a great fit. So honored and happy to be here with you guys.
Great. Thank you so much, Joel, for that quick introduction. Going into the theme of today in the talk, it's about risk management relating to career, business, and as well as personal life. So the first question I want to ask you is, are you a risk taker? I know you've been dealing with startups and founders. So are you a risk taker? And if so, who taught you to take risks?
Yeah. So that's, I mean, ever since I can remember, I mentioned my first company, I was at age 23, but really since I was a little kid, from mowing lawns to any type of work that you could do, legally that you could get paid for, right?
Exactly.
Right? It's always been something that's been ingrained in me. I was raised by a single mom. And so I think having that entrepreneurial spirit was always top of mind. For her to be able to raise my sister and I, and really come from a place of love and a place that it wasn't going to be dictated to her what she could or she couldn't do. So just being around that my whole life. And I think later on when I, transitioned into my career, right, I think there's been a lot of those stages where, you think you want to get to a certain place in your career path or development. And, you get to a point, and I know for me, it's happened a few times where you kind of drink the Kool-Aid and you think that, oh, I'm doing well. I have this, amazing career. And before you know it, right, whether that's a crash in 2008 or different types of scenarios over the last decade of my career, where you see people who had been at a company for, 10, 15, 20 years. And from one day to the next, you have an executive team that comes from up north. They basically come in and literally you have entire departments being wiped out. And so I think that really kind of set the context for me of, what risk really means. And so I think kind of that speaks to the topic of today's conversation, which, how do you evaluate risk? And I think for many of us, and those of us to be either Gen Zs or millennials, or in my case, kind of borderline between a Gen Xer and a millennial, you realize that risk is not something that you're always going to have all the factors to be able to measure it. And so I think it's important for us to identify, if you were to ask, what's a secure, what's a very risk-free career path, most people would tell you, you go to college, you graduate, and you hope that you land a great job. Well, now if you do that, right, you're dead in the water because there's not a lot of, security, especially with the current environment that we're in right now. And so I think being a risk taker has been ingrained in every facet of my career and all the way through, the work that I do now, which is basically, being an entrepreneur. And we can talk a little more about how that whole process came about. But I think it's always been ingrained. But as far back as I can date it, I've just been immersed in it. And I think my family, my mom especially, was a huge influence in me to make sure that I was able to do anything I wanted, as long as I was able to put the hard work in it and realizing that it wasn't going to be given to me. So I think that is where that whole notion of risk and the perspective of it really started.
Yeah, definitely. So you said you touched upon about your mom kind of being a big role, deviating from the questions a little bit. But would you say
all good, man.
Would you say support played a big role in for you kind of learning how to take risk? That you had that support in the background from your mother or someone else?
Yeah, well, I think it depends, right? Because the support was always there, moral support, right? Encouragement, but there wasn't any financial support. And so I think at a very young age, I realized that if I wanted to do anything, there wasn't going to be any issues with her or anyone else in my family I'll give you an example, right? So if I wanted to play sports as an example, I was like, yeah, great. I grew up in California, so it was always about, having that level of freedom, but she was not going to pay for my uniforms as an example. Right. And so at that stage, right, I realized, well, I have the go ahead. So if I want to play, it's on me. And so I think at a very young age, you start to kind of cultivate that mindset. And so I asked my coaches and I was like, hey, I love to play, but at the time I was like, I can't, my mom's not going to pay for the uniforms. Like, what can I do? And they were like, well, we have these programs that we do for every game. And so we're actually, part of the package is like, if you can sell ad placements, right, for the games, then basically you can give you the whole equipment, the whole, shoes and all the uniforms, basically for free. And so like, you can do that. And I think that was the first moment that I realized that it wasn't so much about this concept of having or not having. It was about becoming resourceful. And long story short, right? So I ended up literally going through I would just walk down the street. I would go into every single store that I could find. luckily I'm bilingual, so I can go in and tackle basically both sides of the street, right? To say. And so when the whole thing came about, I remember the coach called me and was like, "Hey, Joel, listen, so you sold basically more than what's needed. Like, is there like," I was like, "Wait, what do you mean? I still have to go back for another round." So I remember I ended up with 2 sets of uniforms and 2 sets of shoes. And so I think that was the first time that I realized that it was really up to me. And so that encouragement, to your point of support, it was always very clear to me that, it was kind of giving me free reign to do what I wanted to do, but I had to put in the hard work. And just like that, I mean, I can share any number of experiences, right? Whether that's, kind of graduating from school, or later on, when I decided to kind of move from California and start my own business in Mexico and do all these things, that at age 23, one of the great things, and what I'm so excited about now coming back and hopefully sharing my insights with youth and future leaders, is that sometimes not knowing can be your greatest asset, right? Like the example that I mentioned, I didn't know that you could actually just keep going, right? And selling more things. I didn't really have a specific goal in mind. I just felt like that's what I needed to do. Or same thing as you start looking at, building your first company, right? A lot of times, if you know more about, risk taking and so forth, you may not actually take that risk or that leap of faith. And oftentimes when you don't know, it's when you're like, man, I look back at it now, like I wouldn't have done the things that I've did in my 20s, right? Because now you have that perspective. We're like, man, that's super risky, and I don't even know if that's going to work. But I feel like that's all that to say, is being able to take those risks when you don't have all the facts is as important as you get later on in life, right, in your career, when you have a little more at stake, to say, where is that entrepreneurial spirit. And there's a few things. I actually have a couple pictures that I have. I'm not sure if I'm able to share, that basically I think encompasses this quite well. And I wanted to share that with the with the group here.
Yeah, let me see. There we go. I think you have
perfect permission. So let me know if you guys can see this. Can you guys see my screen?
It's loading. Okay, I can see it.
Perfect. So a couple of things around this that I think really sets the tone for that. So one of the areas that I felt, was really important, you probably have heard this, kind of notion of like, most people think this path to success is usually like, oh, you started here and now you're, at this, a place in your career and your life that, seems to be quote unquote successful. When in reality, it's all these kind of different turns and twists and everything that I didn't plan early on that has really led me to have the greatest level of satisfaction in my career now at this stage. And, to your point of kind of where that really cemented for me was this whole concept of, this entrepreneur's formula, right? And so talking about, the whole risk-taking factor, this is one of those areas that's been key in my life. And, hopefully this can serve in other people's journey as well, where, most people think about starting a company or becoming an entrepreneur as something that's, very challenging, or it takes a lot of courage. Well, I can tell you, when you walk into, and I'm sure you probably, I wonder how many people here on the call have been through that experience where you have an idea, you think it's a great idea, and someone should definitely build it, and you do nothing about it, right? How many of us can relate? Should raise the hands, right? We all kind of be like, oh, it'd be amazing if you can only do it. My wife is notorious for this. She comes up with the best ideas. And I think she's like, great, now you do it. But I think there's a huge gap, right, between wanting to do something or having an idea and actually following through on it. That to me, that happened in 2016 when I had been toying with the idea of essentially building a technology company here in Miami, focus on augmented or virtual reality, focus on commercial real estate, and all these things that, having the privilege of working with a number of incubators and companies, you start to see these gaps, right, in the market. And so to me, it just felt like a no-brainer, but I didn't do anything about it for a few years. I mean, I think that the idea started around 2013, 14, when I was still kind of at my 9-to-5. And 2015 or so is when I remember going to a conference, and there it was, right? There was a booth that had the same idea. And I think the part that made it worse is that they were poorly executing on it, right? I mean, and now that's where I think this whole concept of the entrepreneur's formula came about, where, this pain, right, that I've always had of uncertainty, how am I going to leave my job? How am I going to do all these things that are required of an entrepreneur? And I don't know if I'm ready. And all these limiting beliefs were trumped in an instant right? Most people think about, oh, making a decision took me, 20, 30 years. Like, no, making a decision can be instant. It might take you a number of years to get to that point. But once I saw that, right, and I felt like I walked out of the conference, I couldn't say anything. I was like, my stomach hurt. I don't know if anyone's been there where like your gut hurts, it's physical, and it gets to a point where I realized that the pain of not taking action had become greater than the pain of facing uncertainty. And that, I think, was the beginning of that entrepreneurial journey for me, at least, in getting to a point where I realized that it wasn't going to be anything that had to do with me being ready, because we're never going to be ready. But it was really more about asking some of these questions around what it takes to actually make that process work, right? What is that, as I kind of have some of the different areas here, this whole concept, right? As, one of my mentors says, that life is that dance between what you desire most and what you fear most. And I feel like that in many ways encompasses this whole concept of, taking risk, right? If you know what you're doing, if you know why you're doing it, then the what, it's a lot easier to kind of come through. Anyway, so that's some of the things I just wanted to share as far as the entrepreneurial journey and how that kind of got started.
No, thank you for that. And kind of what struck me the most was kind of going back to what you said about being a young kid and trying to get jerseys. Is you said the word resourcefulness,
yeah,
which I love, being resourceful, and that kind of. And then you went into my next point was kind of like, when have you turned risk into opportunity? And you kind of clearly stated where, when you saw risk, there were certain components where it was like you just said, the pain of not doing it was greater than the pain of the uncertainty. And so on that note of starting something,
yeah,
how do you know when to stop? I know you take the risk, you begin the journey. Do you ever sit there and realize like, what am I doing? Or
so
cut your losses.
That's a great question. I think for that, there's a couple of things that might be helpful for your audience, and a couple areas that I think are interesting to look at as we start to see and evaluate risk, right? What does that entail, and how do we know when we've gone too far? And so usually the way that I assess risk boils down to 6 key areas that I usually go through, right? And I think the answer to that question really goes back to the 5th one here that we see on the list. So typically, if I'm going to just kind of walk you briefly through, when you're looking at, when do you stop taking risk? Short answer, right, is when you go too far, right? And I think when you're early in your career, it makes it easy, right? Because you have less to lose, right? You always have a safety net, call parents or call family or something else. I have now family, I have my daughter, my son, I got other people that I'm responsible for. I have team members, I have, a lot of contract workers and teams that it just becomes a little bit harder. Not that you can't do it. And I feel like there's a really important key of how do you keep that entrepreneurial spirit while still being responsible based on the people that you are called to serve. And so I think the part here that I want to leave with you is, usually if you start with this framework of what is it that I'm trying to achieve, right? And the example that I mentioned before, if it was about, hey, I wanted to play basketball. I didn't even think about jerseys. I didn't even realize that I had to have a jersey and a uniform, and that's what was keeping me from it, which in this case goes back to number 2, right? So if you realize what was keeping you from it, then I think it's easier to figure out, okay, what can I do? So the key risk, right? Going back to that analogy or that story, the key risk is like, hey, if I don't get a uniform, my mom said yes, but I'm not going to be able to play, right? Because I can't just go to show up and not have, the uniform that's needed. And then you have to realize, what's the most important thing? So once you realize what you're after, and then you realize, hey, what's keeping me from getting there? Well, what's the most important thing? To me, the most important thing at the time was the fact that I had my mom's permission. I didn't have to worry about, hey, I don't want you to get hurt, or I don't want you to leave the house, or I want you to focus on your studies. Luckily, I had good grades at the time, but she was like, hey, figure it out, right? But I think that the next part is that much more important, right? Which is the awareness of understanding, okay, now that I know what I want and what's keeping me from it and what's most important, well, should I do something about it? And if so, what should I do about it, right? And that's where it starts to create more clarity around that. And I think it's as important when you start taking action to also have this sort of after action review, so that you know whether the actions that you're taking are leading you somewhere, right? Or they're not working. Because a lot of times what happens, I see so many founders, especially in early stage companies, get frustrated, or they feel like, oh man, I can't move forward because we haven't raised our next round of funding. And I usually call BS, right? Because we're self-funded, and I've seen that with so many other people that is usually this precursor to success. So I'm not doing this because, right? So and so, whatever external factor, right? As I mentioned before in that graph of like the success path, right? But it's always comes back to us, right? If the action that I'm taking works, great, right? Then I can modify it. If not, then I need to understand why that's not working. And I think the last thing that it's also really important, and I think this is something that's been a huge lesson for me, especially over the last 5 years, is has anything changed? Sometimes we set these goals, right, when we're in our early 20s, that by the time you get, to any point in your career, you realize like, that's not even my goal. Like that's like someone else's goal that I thought I wanted, right? Like for me, I wanted to be a creative director for a long time, or kind of go up all the different corporate ladder roles. And once I got there, I was miserable. Like, that's not me. Like I had to clock in, I had to have schedules, I had to do all these things in exchange, right, for this quote unquote success, when in reality, all I really wanted was to be creative and build the things and products and companies that could help other people along the way. And so that, I think, it's one of those areas where if you were to kind of map out any sort of, decision-making process and, knowing when you have gone too far, I usually just run through those same, type of questions. And there's more, but I felt like that's just a good way to kind of synthesize how I usually do my decision-making process, and more importantly, how I validate that, not just with me, but with the people that I'm responsible for, and the people that I'm so privileged to be able to help and mentor along the way.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you so much, Joel, for sharing that presentation, kind of keeping it a little bit visual. So I appreciate that. Thank you for your points. I would open it up for questions, but we're a bit on a time crunch. So they'll definitely be able to catch you on LinkedIn if you want to put your LinkedIn in the chat. And throughout these activities, they could probably ask you in the breakout room. So thank you so much, Joel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No problem.